Welcome to Teaching 8th Grade U.S. History. This is session 7. We are going to spend the next hour taking a look at the upcoming unit that you're about to teach. So we're going to dive right in. My name is Molly Gale. I'm a social studies consultant at Oakland Schools, and my two colleagues who couldn't be here tonight are Stacy Woodward and Chris Lee. So this is just a quick reminder. We have an in-person full-day workshop about teaching Reconstruction. We're really excited. Facing History and Ourselves is coming to work with us to present this unit, which is Unit 9. And they'll be there from 8:30 to 3 p.m. We're hosting it at Oakland Schools. If you're interested in registering, check out the SMORE. It has all of the registration information at the top, and it will give teachers a chance to take a look at the upcoming unit about Reconstruction, to build some content knowledge, to look at the pedagogical approach as well in this unit, to experience some of the student activities, and also just to network with teachers who are going to be teaching this unit as well. So we would love to see you. Okay, so this is the unit graphic organizer for Unit 7. So I'm going to give you a second just to take a look and just reflect to yourself. How is this similar to or different from how you usually teach this unit? So you're looking in this unit at the events that were leading up to the outbreak of the Civil War. One thing you might be noticing is this timeline actually spans further than just the 1850s. So while in this unit, we do focus on the decade before the Civil War breaks out, we do some recall of events we've studied prior to the 1850s as well. And you'll notice above the timeline in green, we have some big themes noting. These are themes and issues that had really been a part of the fabric of the US since the beginning of colonization. And kids have a chance to look at not only the specific events, but also these themes that were going on and these issues that had been boiling at the surface and just under the surface for hundreds of years. So just a reminder, this is where we're at right now. Unit 6 is where we left off, looking at how do we build justice in a democratic society? What does that take? Students looked at some of the reform movements going on specifically in the early to mid 1800s. The unit we are going to take a look at tonight is Unit 7, and it's looking at why did the Civil War break out when it did? So I wanted to give you an idea to think about some of the framing we had as we approached this unit. I think that's helpful to know as you're heading into teaching it. Again, our compelling question that students are investigating over the course of the unit is, why did the Civil War break out when it did? So kids are taking a look specifically at 1820 to 1860, but really focusing on that decade right before the Civil War broke out. So things we thought about as we were preparing this unit. One thing we wanted to make sure we did was not present the Civil War as inevitable. Historians would argue that inevitability in history is not something they would typically discuss. They are looking instead on the choices and actions that people made that led to whatever event occurred. So we're really helping kids in this unit think about the choices and actions that people made from the colonization of the country all the way through the Revolutionary era and then into the 1850s, and how those choices and actions ended up leading to the war breaking out when it did. So it broke out when it did for particular reasons, and kids have a chance to look at that. So we give kids a chance to analyze events and issues between 1820 and 1861 in depth, but they really focus on the 1850s. And we also are giving kids a chance to build some more chronological context. There are a couple of exceptions in the unit, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where students study a person's actions over the course of multiple events. So those events are out of their chronology, but that's a case study, giving a kids a chance to dig deeply on one person's actions. And another thing we wanted to make sure we did in this unit was make studying the Civil War relevant. Why are we studying the Civil War today? Why does it still matter? It's still a central part of historical scholarship, and we want to bring kids in that discussion to figure out why. And last, but of course not least, we are always continuing to build students' disciplinary reading, writing, and thinking skills. So you will see many of those same skills coming up and being deepened during this unit. So I'm going to give you just a second to take a look at the lesson layout. As I mentioned, the compelling question is, why did the Civil War break out when it did? I'm going to let you look through that lesson sequence. And then we're going to dive in, and I'm going to give you a guided tour of the unit, taking you through each one of these lessons components. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is your guided tour of the unit. I'm going to give you kind of the best of each lesson and show you what kids are doing and what they're grappling with in each one. So in lesson 1, we actually start with the lesson question, why do historians still study the Civil War? This is right, that enduring question. Why do we have to study this? And we know the Civil War history is still like studied by many, many people, and it's a central part of historical scholarship. So we're going to have kids take a look at that. The first thing we have kids look at is the magnitude of the Civil War. We really want to frame this for them. So we give the kids a chance to look at a video clip. They look at some graphs and charts and maps. You see a couple of them here. And it gives our students a chance to really look at the magnitude of the Civil War and what it meant to the country at the time and why that magnitude had an enduring legacy. The next thing we're going to have kids do is actually recall some prior knowledge about what they remember about the regions of the country and sectionalism, which they've dug into during the course already. And after they've recalled some of that prior knowledge, we present them with these sources. We give them an article from historian James McPherson and an interview with McPherson, who is a Civil War historian. And we give them a chance to look at what he says the reason we study the Civil War is today. So we take them into that disciplinary perspective of looking at what a historian would say. And then we have the students actually do a QFT of an infographic. So you're taking a look at it here. And as you might imagine, there's a lot to think about and talk about with this infographic. This is an infographic that's looking at the dedication of Confederate monuments and the use of Confederate iconography, both shortly after the Civil War and actually during the Civil War, and then all the way up to 2018. So the kids do a QFT on this, and they're compiling those questions into an anchor chart that they're going to be able to refer to throughout the course of the unit as they think about the Civil War, why it broke out when it did, and really why it still matters today. Students end, let me just go back for a second. Students end by actually tackling that lesson question. They do a rotating stations discussion, and they move from table to table, adding ideas to a piece of chart paper on the table. So as they move, they're able to build on and connect with their classmates' ideas. So after that lesson, where students have really framed the study of the Civil War, they move into lesson 2. The question in this one is, was the country moving toward or away from its ideals of freedom and equality and the Declaration of Independence? The students have studied the Declaration of Independence, of course, in the course already, and they've come back to it before. So we're having them stop here and really take a second to recall what they've already learned up until the 1850s and to think about whether the country was moving toward those ideals or away from those ideals. This is the lesson graphic organizer, just to give you a feel for the setup of this. And the first thing we have students do is create a Venn diagram where they're really just reviewing what they know from the course so far about free Black people, including those who escaped from slavery, enslaved people, and free white people. So we give them a chance to first do some recall. And then we actually bring them back to a review of the nation's ideals, and we have a chance to really chart them out. What are those ideals and where were those ideals found? The next thing we're going to have students do, it's called the Unscramble This Timeline activity. We actually give them a short description of each of the events. So we're not asking them to go back and look that up. We're telling them this is what the event was in case you need a reminder. But what we do have them do is cut up these events. And there's multiple pages of these. I'm showing you the first page here. And then they arrange them sequentially. So we're having them think about cause and effect relationships over the course of, well, you can see over the course of the Declaration of Independence all the way until the 1850s. After they've done that and they've charted this out, and you can see actually before the Declaration of Independence, we make sure we take it back to 1619 as well to frame that. We have the students do some historiography work. We have them think about eras, and we talk about how historians use eras to chunk time. We have them think about what they would name the era that we're about to study right before the Civil War. We also have them think about if there's another place they think the division would be better suited. Where should that era actually begin? And then students, of course, at the end, come back to the lesson question. They think about whether the country was moving toward its ideals or away from its ideals. And we have them actually highlight each of these events in a different color. They highlight events that they think signify to move toward the nation's ideals in one color, and events they think signify to move away from the nation's ideals in another color. They end the lesson with a barometer discussion where there's two ends of the room moving toward the nation's ideals and away from it, and they choose where they want to stand along it. They don't have to pick one extreme or the other. They can pick somewhere in the middle. And then at the end, after that barometer discussion, they have a chance to journal and answer the lesson question. In lesson 3, the question is, what does the political debate of the 1850s reveal about polarization in the US at the time? So they really, in this lesson, look at the political conversations happening in the 1850s and what that tells us about polarization. The students start with doing a visual thinking strategy of, as you can see, this lithograph of the caning in the Senate. They also do a read aloud of, it's from the United States Senate's website, of this event. There's a read aloud provided as well within the MC3. Then they actually read about the event itself, and they think about how this helps them think about the lesson question. What is this making them start thinking about that lesson question? So we get them addressing that very early in the lesson. And then there's some direct instruction that's going to look at the evolution of political parties. So the students specifically are going to focus on the evolution of the Whigs and the Democrats in the 1830s to the 1850s, and then what happened to those parties. So you can see they took a look at some electoral maps as part of that direct instruction. They also look at the two political parties, and they look at which political parties they were breaking into. And we help kids see that the Whigs and the Democrats then broke into multiple political parties and show them the evolution of how we ended up getting the birth of the Republican Party and then the Democratic Party, which actually had some divisions within it. Students take part in a give one, get one discussion strategy to reflect on the lesson question at that point. So they have a chance to give some ideas and get some ideas from students. And there is an extension at the end of the first day of the lesson that is 2 videos that help kids look at how current political parties are formed. So it takes them from this point where you left off in class all the way to the present day political parties. And students do a connect extend challenge with that. So if teachers choose to do that extension, they can. When students come back to the lesson on day 2, they start by doing a little bit of prior knowledge building about Calhoun, Clay, and Webster, who they encountered in prior units. And then they have a little bit of direct instruction about these 3 as well. They next watch a short documentary from Ken Burns about those 3 figures. And then they do a graffiti board activity around the room using quotes from these 3 people. So each one of the graffiti boards has one of these quotes you're seeing on the screen, and there's a few more as well. And they're looking at trying to figure out what they think that quote meant and who probably said it based on what they know about those 3. At the end, students, of course, debrief that graffiti board activity, and then they really center on a question that I think is an enduring one, which is, what is discourse and what should it look like in a democracy? And the kids have that 1850s political arena to help them frame that idea, and then hopefully to make some connections to today. Lesson 4 is a question that I think every middle schooler wants to talk about. Is it ever okay to break the law? So in this lesson, what students are taking a look at is the historical context is the Fugitive Slave Act. They start by getting some direct instruction about the Fugitive Slave Act. So it starts with talking about the Compromise of 1850 and how the Fugitive Slave Act was part of that. They then do a primary source activity where they work their way through a number of sources and they pull out the central idea. They use some evidence to support why they think that's the central idea, and they look at the author's point of view or purpose. So they're looking at loaded language, inclusion, or avoidance of particular facts. Things they look at in this one, they look at warnings for Black people to avoid enslavers. They look at an order that was sent to a marshal to capture a freedom seeker. They look at an image, which I'll show you in just a second, and they look at an advertisement for a freedom seeker. There is a note, again, about language in these sources. We always want to make sure we're bringing students back to addressing language ahead of them encountering language in those sources. And there's also a really important note in this lesson about stereotypes. And it does specifically talk about one of the sources that has a stereotypical racist description of an enslaved person who had escaped. And we want to make sure teachers talk about that with their students ahead of time. This shows you just a couple of those sources to give you a feel for what they look like. And I should have noted as well, there is a full teacher guide with the source analysis completed in the supplemental materials. So those are ready for you as the instructor. So you feel confident in, of course, scaffolding students as they analyze these sources. The next thing students do in this lesson is they start by being introduced to the idea of civil disobedience. And you can see on the screen, it's not just a single definition, but we give some descriptions of civil disobedience. And then they flash to a contemporary case study. They look at a video with Bree Newsom as an example. And then students do an envelope activity where they look at 8 examples of civil disobedience throughout not only US history, but throughout world history. After they've done this analysis, they review those sources as a class. This just gives you an idea of a couple of them. You can see one is about Susan B. Anthony. This one is about Gandhi. And again, I said there's 8, so that they span the US and the world and a range of time. But giving kids a chance to grapple with this idea of civil disobedience. And then after that envelope activity, they come back and create their own definition of civil disobedience, and they record it on the back of their word card. Students engage in a Socratic Circle fishbowl discussion at that point in the lesson, and they're really grappling with some of these big questions. For instance, they look at quotes by respected historical figures and saw what they said about the role of civil disobedience. They look at how do we know if a law is unjust, and what current laws do they think are worthy of people using civil disobedience to challenge. So these are some really important questions, and kids have a chance to engage in those with each other through the fishbowl. And then, of course, at the end of the lesson, they come back to that lesson question: is it ever okay to break the law? And they write an argument to that in their journals. And this was just showing you an example of those questions they're taking a look at in the fishbowl. So in lesson 5, we actually transitioned to really a case study of John Brown. He's, of course, a significant and polarizing figure in the 1850s. And this is one of those lessons where the students are learning about a couple of events out of chronological order, because we want to make sure they have a chance to look at Brown's actions, not only in Kansas, but then to flash forward and look at the attack on Harper's Ferry, which of course occurred much later. So students start this lesson by, first of all, coming back to the compelling question for the unit and reflecting on what they know so far about it. Then they are introduced to the lesson question, and they're really introduced to this as well. But the framing is thinking about it that this is a question that historians are still debating. So this is still a question historians are taking up. Was John Brown a domestic terrorist, or was he a martyr? The beginning of the lesson has students clarify some vocabulary. So they take a look at a definition they've already seen in the course in Unit 6, martyr. And then we also have them look at 2 vocab words they've already had, or 2 vocabulary concepts, domestic policy and terrorist. And we have them put these together and think about, they've looked at domestic policy before. We have them think about what a domestic terrorist would be. After we've done that, students get some direct instruction, which is about not only John Brown, but about the context in which he was living. They then take a look at a video of what occurred during Bleeding Kansas. And they do a reading about Bleeding Kansas. There's some background information and then a primary source. Then we take students forward to Harper's Ferry and we say, okay, not only did this happen in Kansas, let's show you what happened closer to the outbreak of the Civil War at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And students at that point return to the lesson question, and they're like, okay, was John Brown, at this point, with what I know and the evidence I have, would I argue that he was a domestic terrorist or a martyr? They also then at the end of that day reflect on what they think they still need to know. What do we need to know in order to answer the lesson question? They come up with a list of questions they think they still need to seek answers to, and they choose one of those questions to pursue for homework. And then when they come back, they share their findings, and they are scaffolded to read laterally. So for homework, you can't just pull one source. They need to take a look at some lateral reading skills in order to come back with an answer. The next day, they share out what they've learned, and then they take a look at this painting, and they do the visual thinking strategy about this. And you can see there's once again a lot to talk about. And then we bring them to his address to the court, probably his most well-known speech. When he gives his speech to the court prior to, when he was about to receive as it says in there, about to receive the sentence that was the sentence of death. They take a look at his speech and text, but they also listen to it being performed at the same time. So they're listening to it being performed while they follow along with their text. And as they do, they're again going two colors of highlighter. What are they noting of evidence that he was a martyr, and what does he say that is evidence that he was a domestic terrorist? So they track both of those throughout his speech, and then they have a chance to talk about it again. So we're bringing them back to the fishbowl setup, and they end the lesson by looking at what historians say about John Brown. There's a note here for teachers too, to keep in mind that this lesson was designed for school, right? We wrote this lesson, designed it for 8th graders in school. Historians are less inclined to categorize him as one or the other. Historians are much more likely to, when they frame John Brown, to look at him as more in the middle, or to frame him as there were some things he did that were domestic terrorism, but there were some things he did that might have classified him as a martyr. So while students may choose one extreme or the other, and historians would likely not do that, but we do have a teacher note explaining that. And at the end of the lesson, students come back and write an argument. So lesson 6, students are moving through the 1850s, and now we're to the point where students are looking at the Dred Scott versus Sandford case. And the lesson question is, why does it matter who is on the Supreme Court? I love this question because I think it's also so enduring. Like, why does it matter now who's on the Supreme Court? And so kids have a chance to really think of what's going on in the US today and what's going to go on in their future lives, and to think about why that mattered in the 1850s. Students start by looking at a number of Supreme Court decisions that were ruled 5-4, starting to dig into this question of why does it matter who's on the court? And then they have a little bit of direct instruction about the court's makeup and its role. And you can see they look at the current court as of when we wrote this, it was 2022. And they then look at an overview of the Dred Scott versus Sandford case. So they get a little bit of background about the case, and they watch a video that does a nice job of setting up the case for them. What was this case about? Then what students do is this really, I think, rich and interesting activity where they dive into the Gilder Lehrman Institute's online exhibit about the Dred Scott decision and its bitter legacy. That's the title of the exhibit. As students work their way through this amazing digital exhibition, and they're looking at primary sources, secondary sources, and photos and maps, it's very interactive. They have a graphic organizer, which you're seeing right here, that helps them work their way through the exhibit and draw out evidence and analyze the case. When they finish, and there is a teacher guide for that provided again as well, so it's completely filled in for the teacher. When they're done with that and they've really had a chance to look at this case and analyze its impact, they come back and they read from iCivics, a secondary source that summarizes the Dred Scott case and its importance, and they critique that. They look at what do they think is missing from the iCivics summary of the case, what was left out, and if they could add a section to that document, to that worksheet that students are reading, what would they add? And what further questions do they have? What are they still wondering? And the students, of course, at the end come back to that lesson question and answer it. In lesson 7, this is the other example in the unit of where some events are taught out of their chronological order. This lesson has students look at the lesson question, Does Lincoln deserve the title of the great emancipator? In order for students to look at his evolving policy on emancipation, students have to look at a series of events that are not necessarily all in order, but that's framed in the lesson, and the teacher talks about that with students. So students start the lesson with a video introduction of Lincoln, and they think about how the video portrays Lincoln. It gives kids a chance to think, who probably produced this video? Was the person who produced this a fan of Lincoln, not a fan of Lincoln? They then do some vocabulary work. So they clarify the definition of emancipation. And then students watch an interview with Eric Foner, who's a very well-known historian who specifically has studied this era. And they listen to it twice. So the first time they just listen and kind of soak it in. The second time they actually they create the spectrum that Eric Foner is describing. And when they finish as a class, you pull together and make sure everybody's on the same page, but it looks something like this. On one end of the spectrum is this belief that there should have been immediate abolition and racial equality. On the far end of that, there's the belief that there should be permanent slavery in the US and the view that Black people were inferior to whites. And in the middle, there's this belief that ending slavery would be a long process and the races couldn't live together. So this supported either paying enslavers to free enslaved people or gradually emancipating them or seeking colonization efforts, but it's somewhere in the middle. So once students have done this, they then work their way through a series of Lincoln's quotes. Again, there's a language note for teachers in here, which is important to have that conversation with students ahead of time. But in this activity, they're actually reading excerpts from Lincoln's speeches, from his letters, from his various writings. So they're reading Lincoln's words in these variety of contexts, and you'll notice there's not dates on these, so they don't know that yet. And they place them along the spectrum. And what they notice as they go through this is that Lincoln's beliefs about emancipation, they change over time. They place them along the spectrum. There are 7 of them, and they have to share their placements and their reasoning. So they have to have a reason they're putting each one where they're putting it. At the end of the lesson, there's a chance to come together and compare placements. This is the example in the slide deck, which is to be used in class, of course, with students, and it shows Lincoln's movement. And these ones you'll notice have the dates, so kids can see that over the course of time, Lincoln's beliefs and policies about emancipation did progress along a spectrum. Students then come back at the end and they're able to write an argument to that lesson question. Does he deserve the title of the great emancipator? Lesson 8 is the last lesson of the unit. And it's, again, a lesson that I really love because I think it's really relevant to kids, and they're interested in what's going on right now in this debate in the country, and it gives them the opportunity to look at the historical context for it as well. How does where we live affect how we learn about Southern secession, and why does that matter? So students start this lesson. They first return to that anchor chart they did in lesson 1 in response to the QFT, and they look at what they can answer now. What have they been able to answer, and what do they still not have answers to? Students also take a look at this timeline. This is a timeline that they've progressively built over the course of the unit as they've studied the events. So you can see by lesson 8, they've taken a look at the Wilmot Proviso. They've looked at the Fugitive Slave Act, the Compromise of 1850, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Bleeding Kansas. They've moved all the way up to almost Lincoln being elected president, and that's where this lesson picks up. The first thing students do is they take a look at a quote from James McPherson, who's a historian, and they look at the explanation that professional historians largely agree that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. Like that is largely not up for debate in the community of historians. Then they take a look at another video clip from Ken Burns, and the question is, why did seven Southern states secede after Lincoln was elected? And this gives the kids a chance to look at Lincoln's election and how that spurred Southern secession. There is a very important, again, language note in here. In the video clip, one of the sources that the students can see in the video uses the N-word. So you want to make sure that conversation is had with students ahead of time. Students then take a look at the 1860 electoral map, and they analyze that map, looking at, of course, you're looking at some patterns going on. Then they read an article from Newsella, which is about lessons taught on the Civil War and its causes can depend on where you live. So this is really starting to get at the heart of that lesson question. Students use a graphic organizer for analyzing a written document to gather findings. And the teacher is given some key points, which I'm just putting on the screen right now. There's some key points provided for the teacher to help students as they're reading. So these are some things you want to make sure you're scaffolding kids to think about as they're reading, if they're not inherently doing it already. Students return to the lesson question at that point and start to gather some ideas about it. They also have this question put in front of them. Some people, predominantly in the South, still continue to glorify the Confederacy and what they believe it stood for. Historians, though, generally agree that slavery was the main cause of the war. This is supported with voluminous evidence from a wide range of sources. Why might it be at the very least troubling to argue that the Civil War was primarily caused by something other than slavery? Students have a chance to look at that. Then they move into the next day of this lesson where they actually look at social studies standards, which, students are, what we're teaching is based on the standards, and students have a chance to really look at those standards. They start by looking at the Michigan standards, and they'll notice in U 5.1.6, there are a number of disagreements noted. So it says, describe how major issues debated at the Constitutional Convention, such as disagreements over distribution of political power, rights of individuals, liberty and property, rights of states, the election of the executive, and slavery, help explain the Civil War. What they do is a gallery walk where they do graffiti boards of these different agreements. They think about everything they know about each of those topics from the year, and they know quite a bit at this point. When they get back to their starting paper, and everybody else has contributed ideas, then they actually start to categorize those, and they categorize them by either political, economic, or social categories. Then they go through and they highlight all of the ideas on that graffiti board that are related to slavery. And the question is, what do you notice? And what they will notice, and the teacher, there's, of course, in the lesson plan, it explains this, scaffolds this, they'll notice that they're all related to slavery. All of these topics come back to slavery being the cause of the Civil War. Then students take a look at standards from 3 other states. And again, they look at how those states are addressing teaching Southern secession. What are some differences? What are some similarities? And as a final activity, the students look at, so in California, the standards are from 1998, but they've issued a framework in 2017. And the students look at the framework, and then they look back at the standard from 1998, and they look at what changed. And students come back at the end of this lesson to think about, why does it matter how they address the causes of the war and Southern secession? Why does it matter how we teach that? The very end of the lesson, which of course is the end of the unit, the students preview the Civil War, which will be the upcoming unit, with a visual thinking strategy by looking at a map of Southern secession. The summative performance task in this unit gives kids a few different options. So one thing they can do is write an argument. They can create a podcast. They can create an annotated timeline. They can also create a time machine letter to a member of the Constitutional Convention to help the framers make better decisions to avoid a civil war. And they also have the option of hosting and filming a panel discussion. So lots of different ways students can craft an argument to that compelling question, which was, why did the Civil War break out when it did? So thinking of what were these choices and actions that people made prior to the Civil War that caused it to break out at that time. As an extension, students examine current political divisions to determine which issues are predominantly dividing the nation, and then they develop a plan that politicians could follow to avoid ongoing division. And then they look at their textbooks, or a textbook they have access to, the explanation of the coming of the Civil War, and they look at what was included and what was not included. They come up with some ideas of changes they would make to more fully address why the war broke out in 1861, and then they create revisions and either present it to their class or submit it to a publisher. So over the course of the unit, students have really built this deep understanding of what occurred in the 1850s, the decisions and the actions that were made. And this unit has really set the students up to be ready for the next unit, Unit 8, where they look at the Civil War itself. So thank you for being with us tonight and for watching this recording. If you're watching it afterwards, our next Zoom meeting is For our next Zoom meeting that's going to talk about Unit 8, the Civil War, is Wednesday, March 22nd, again from 4:30 to 5:30 on Zoom. However, and these are a little bit out of order, Monday, March 20th is the day, like I noted at the beginning, where we are going to hold our in-person reconstruction workshop to look at Unit 9, to look at teaching reconstruction. So we will hope to see you in person on the 20th, and we're going to backtrack a little, and 2 days later on the 22nd on Zoom, we will take a look at Unit 8, which is the Civil War. If you have any questions, of course, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is there. Please don't hesitate to email if you have questions or need clarifications or just need a thought partner. And I am here to answer questions and help in any way that I can. I hope you have a great rest of the night, and hopefully we will see you soon.